Bantam Audio Publishing presents The Chancellor Manuscript by Robert Ludlum. June 3rd, 1968. The dark-haired man stared at the wall in front of him. He was in his late 20s, his face angular, the features sharp. The eyes were engaging, deep-set, and very light blue. The young man's name was Peter Chancellor, and the expression on his face was as rigid as his posture in the chair. His eyes were angry. There was one other person in this outer office, a middle-aged secretary whose thin, colorless lips were set in constant tension. She was the attack dog who protected the sanctuary of the man behind the oak door beyond her desk. Monroe St. Clair had been Under-Secretary of State for Roosevelt and Truman, Ambassador Extraordinary for Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. That he had elected to spend a spring semester at Park Forest University as visiting professor of government was a coup that had stunned the trustees of this wealthy but minor college. So the story went. Now Peter Chancellor thought about the salient points of St. Clair's story to keep his mind off his own. Chancellor's doctoral thesis had been rejected by the Honors College. 6 weeks ago, the Foreign Service Journal of Georgetown University had agreed to publish excerpts from the thesis on one condition: doctoral acceptance. Now, of course, publishing any part of it was out of the question. The Origins of Global Conflict was the title. The conflict was World War II, an imaginative interpretation of the men and the forces that collided during the catastrophic years from 1926 to 1939. But Chancellor had committed one cardinal sin. He had attributed invented dialogue to historical figures. The premise was that multinational corporations had financed the Nazi wolf pack, and that among those involved were a number of the most honored industrial names in America. That was the problem. He could not identify those corporations because his proof was not conclusive. The people who had given him the information would not allow their names to be used. So Chancellor took the only option open to him. He changed the names of the corporate giants, but in such a way as to leave no doubt as to their identities. This was his unforgivable error. The secretary's telephone rang. "Yes, Mr. Ambassador," she said. "I'll send him in." Inside the oak-paneled office, Monroe St. Clair got up from behind the antique table that served as his desk. The diplomat greeted Chancellor cordially. He had been impressed with the thesis, he said, although he was aware that it had been rejected by the Honors College. "Tell me about your dissertation. You make some rather frightening judgments. Despite the Honors College, you must have done a fair amount of research. How much?" Suddenly Peter felt very uneasy. "There's very little documentation," he answered, "because that's the way the people I spoke to wanted it." St. Clair leaned forward, his large eyes leveled at Peter. "Basically," he said, "you have the materials for a perfectly valid theoretical analysis, but by your own telling they cannot be properly documented. Your conclusions will never be accepted, not by any recognized authority, academic or judicial, and quite rightly so in my judgment." St. Clair held Peter's eyes. "You sought acceptance from the wrong people," he said. "Seek it elsewhere, where matters of truth and documentation are not important. Your dissertation is filled with some rather splendidly imagined fiction. Why not concentrate on that? Write a novel." Peter stared at the diplomat. He was at a loss. "A novel? Never crossed my mind," he said. "A novel? I'll be damned." Monroe St. Clair smiled. His eyes were strangely non-committal. The afternoon sun disappeared below the horizon. St. Clair stood at the window gazing out. He could leave Park Forest now. His job was finished. He looked at his watch. An hour had passed since the bewildered Chancellor had left the office. The diplomat crossed back to his desk and picked up the telephone. He dialed the area code 202 and then 7 additional digits. Moments later, there were 2 clicks over the line, followed by a whine. Now he dialed 5 more digits. A single click was the result, and a voice answered. "Inver Brass," it said. "Tape rolling." St. Clair spoke. "This is Bravo. Pass me through to Genesis." The line went dead as the Inver Brass switchboard linked up communications. 3 minutes later, another voice was heard as though it were down the street, not 4,000 miles away. "This is Genesis. What happened?" St. Clair reported the results of his meeting with Chancellor. "You're convinced this is the best way?" asked Genesis. Certainly, his eyes narrowed briefly. The alternative is for him to pursue the research and dredge up dormant issues. If he does turn it into a novel, he'll have said what he had to say, and it will turn out to be inconsequential fiction. Interference on our part might raise questions. The man in London agreed, then said goodbye. St. Clair replaced the telephone. He was swept by a sense of revulsion. It was the function of Inver Brass to make decisions others could not make, to aid the country in times of desperate need. Georgetown was rife with rumor. An explosive document had been received from an obscure university in the Midwest. Frightened men had whispered to other frightened men that Peter Chancellor had to be stopped. Yet there were certain gray areas. Accountability was not a limited doctrine. Inver Brass was no exception. Therefore, Peter Chancellor had to be given the chance to vent his outrage and in a way that removed him from consequence or catastrophe. The New York Times Book Review, May 10, 1969. Reichstag is at once startling and perceptive. Peter Chancellor's first novel would have us believe that the early Nazi Party was financed by a cartel of international bankers and industry. The Washington Post Book World, April 22, 1970. In Sarajevo, Chancellor does for the guns of August what he did for the Führer's blitzkrieg last year. The Los Angeles Times Daily Review of Books, April 4, 1971. Counter-strike concerns clandestine operations of the CIA in a New England city. It is Chancellor's best work to date. Autumn. The Bucks County countryside was an ocean of yellow, green, and gold. Peter Chancellor leaned against the hood of a silver Mark IV Continental, his arm casually around a woman's shoulder. His eyes focused on a white house at the foot of a winding drive cut out of the gently sloping fields. The girl with Chancellor was equally engrossed by the house. Her name was Catherine Lowell. She was Peter's fiancée. The house had just been bought as a surprise for her. Peter promised to show it to her when they returned from visiting his parents later in the week. The owners would be out by Thursday. They'd better be, he added. On Friday, Peter was expecting a large delivery from the government printing office. The whole story of Nuremberg recorded by the Allied tribunals. All background for his upcoming book about the Nuremberg trials. Catherine turned to him, her face tilted up, their lips nearly touching. She confessed she was nervous about meeting his parents. "They'll love you," said Peter, pulling her to him, "just as I love you. Oh, God, how I love you." This is Banner, Genesis. It is accurate. This Peter Chancellor has the GPO reprinting everything relative to Nuremberg. You say it does not affect us? That we should take no action? But you're mistaken, Genesis. He is going back to the German theme. It is dangerous. He must be stopped. The traffic on the Pennsylvania Turnpike seemed to move faster as the sky grew darker. A sudden cloudburst of slashing, diagonal rain spattered against Peter's windshield. The voice on the Continental's radio predicted winds of hurricane force, urged motor...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?